excited to have you here today on this podcast to share your wisdom with us. To, before we even get started, I just want to get a little bit of your backstory because people always wonder, I have these esteemed guests that come on this show. They always wonder, okay, so what's the backstory? Like, how did she get to do what she's doing? So if you could share yours with us.
Certainly. My backstory is basically that in the late 1980s, I was working in corporate communications. I was working at some very good companies, but it was extremely apparent how little understanding they had of the kind of value that women could be providing, especially at the leadership level. I felt as if back in that day, the ladies' lounge was where people could smoke. I didn't smoke, but I had to use the ladies' lounge. So I would constantly hear women having these conversations, and I think, I wish the leadership could hear this. There's some real insights here, but there was no way they could. So it gave me the idea that I wanted to write a book that talked about what some of the capabilities women brought were that would be valuable for them as leaders, to organizations as leaders, with the idea of helping the people that I worked with understand what women could provide. So that project, became the book, The Female Advantage, Women's Ways of Leadership, continuously in print since 1990. And it was the first book that focused on what women had to contribute as leaders rather than how they needed to change and adapt. So I think that being the first of anything gives you a big leg up. And companies started having me in and asking me to speak. And I thought, okay, I can do this. And it just went on for from there for almost 35 years.
Well, I love it. And I know you're a trailblazer. You're known as a trailblazer in this whole field of women in leadership. But talk to me a little bit about, so I just want to touch on what you just said, because you said you saw some things that women were contributing. And I'm going to ask you later what's changed since then. But what were those things that you highlighted there?
Well, one of the things was that women really brought a fresh perspective. They had outsider eyes. They weren't a part of the leadership mainstream. So they could often notice in the organization when what a leader had said was not landing well with people, when people were skeptical of it, when it seemed to contradict what people's experience was. And they would articulate that in a very clear way. Whereas in the mainstream organization, the feedback the leaders were getting from the men around them, because it was all men, was usually great job, terrific, you really wowed them this time, and whether they were just sucking up or whether they actually believed it, I don't know. But they weren't getting the truth. Women also had a real appreciation for diversity because they had been outsiders themselves. So it wasn't a kind of a stiff issue of toleration. Women were very good at building strong relationships, and those were becoming increasingly recognized as a leadership skill, not just a soft skill, as they had throughout the 1980s. And women were very good also at bringing some of their experiences as mothers, wives, sisters, people in the neighborhood, volunteers, into the workplace, learning from them, talking about them, sharing them, and then also bringing some of their professional skills into how they manage their personal lives. And this was a big contrast at that time. Henry Mintzberg was big influence at that time, still a extraordinary global level thought leader. Henry had written a book, about management, and he was saying that the biggest problem with the leaders he worked with was that they didn't seem to bring anything of themselves to work, of who they were at home. And indeed, he said most of them, of course, they were all men. It wasn't speaking of them specifically as men, but most of them seemed to regard home as a kind of branch office. So I thought, boy, these women are really different.
Yeah. And obviously things have changed and the workplace has evolved since then, hopefully. And so what do you think now is the biggest misconception about women in leadership?
I think that we are still in a time where women are seen as either too much or not enough.
Mm.
And I'm taken back, this is only a few years ago, but when Mary Barra was promoted to be CEO of General Motors, and she's done an extraordinary job. When she was promoted, the rap on her was she's not tough enough. She's not, she doesn't look like a leader. She's too soft spoken, all this kind of stuff. And that got amplified in the mainstream press every place you turned. And what was amazing was what they didn't seem to notice was that GM had, and when I say they, I mean the journalists or the other leaders who were talking about this, that what they didn't seem to notice was that GM had by that point about 20 years of men who looked like leaders and who were tough enough, and they were basically driving the company into the tank at that point. Right. There were a lot of structural issues, but it was really interesting. So women are either, she's not a leadership type, or well, she eats nails for breakfast. So there's still that idea that there's no middle ground of appropriate leadership style for women.
Right. That what's often been referred to as the double bind, right?
Yeah.
You're either too nice, or you're not enough agency, and not strong enough, or too much of that, right? So what do you think the biggest obstacles women face now in the workplace?
In terms of women leaders getting promoted, I think that and this doesn't just apply to women, right, that the workplace coming out of the pandemic, switch to hybrid, everything, there are two characteristics of today's workplace. One is that in general, it's a pretty lonely place. We don't have those kind of informal third place, as sociologists call them, relationships where we just bump into people. We don't have those so much. Right. So it's a lonely place. And loneliness creates a certain amount of stress. Women have also had a particularly tough time balancing the hybrid workplace if they have young children and those kinds of commitments at home. So that's been really hard. And I think the other thing, and this applies to women and men, but in some ways, because of the other two being really presenting issues for women, that it's a stressful environment to work. Mm-hmm. Where we are with the technology right now, there is no end to the day. Right. I was laughing at a tweet sent out by a colleague the other day where she said, my husband is yelling at me for working too hard one more day on my book about working too hard. And I thought that kind of sums it up. It does. We're all working too hard. Right. There's no boundaries. There's no place to stop. You're put in an exhausting day and, oh no, I didn't check in on LinkedIn and thank people. I think that the fact that it's exhausting and lonely and sometimes difficult to manage, especially for women with children, I think that's the biggest challenge. Yeah.
And that's a hard one, right? I mean, it's a hard one to navigate because it's pervasive everywhere, right? So it's not like people look for these cookie cutter solutions, and there really isn't one because it's such a bigger issue. But talk to me a little bit about your new book, because I think this is fascinating in it, and you cover so many different things, but it's called Rising Together. And can you talk about where you are now in this trajectory of evolution in your thinking regarding women in leadership and what you've been studying? Why this book and why now?
Well, this book, and I'm going to hold it up. Yeah. I'm sure you have it, but I want to hold it up because I'm very proud of it. And I haven't gotten a blouse to match it yet. This blouse still matches How Women Rise. But two things about this book.
It's close.
The big success of How Women Rise convinced me that what people want, especially now, are what they benefit from are very tactical answers to issues that confront them. They don't want someone to come up on stage and say, let me share my leadership model with you.
No.
They want tactical answers. They want hows. And I believe that one of the reasons that How Women Rise was as successful as it was, it's translated into 23 languages. I happen to have the Mongolian edition. I don't know if you
Wow.
can see it up there. I
Yes.
never thought I'd have a Mongolian edition. So the success of that convinced me of that. But I was doing a program out in Las Vegas, and it was the Construction Super Conference. There were about 6,000 people there. You can imagine the percentage who were men.
Right.
And they had asked me out to do a workshop on women's leadership. So I went down to the breakout room, assuming I'd have about 100, 150 women who were struggling in that sector. And what I found was over 300 people, and about 60 or 70% of them, probably more like 70%, were men.
Mm-hmm.
And I was astonished. So I asked them why they were there. And they started talking, not surprisingly, about, well, we realized in order to remain competitive, we've got to do a much better job at attracting and retaining women, et cetera, et cetera. This was not a surprise. But then one man who was the leader of the CEO of a big construction firm stood up and said, we hope you don't waste your time or our time telling us why we need to get better at this. We understand. We don't have any idea how
Wow.
to do it. We don't have a clue. So I thought, very helpful, very interesting. That's my next book. How do we do this? It's more than just collaborating across gender, of course, also. It's how do we build strong and effective teams and relationships when people are very different than we are, and they can be different across gender and age and ethnicity and race and nationality, but also in terms of values, in terms of expertise. The workforce is highly diverse right now. How do we really make that an advantage? And I believe the way we do it is by looking at behaviors, not at bias, by looking at how we act and what we say, not how we may think, by starting with the one and working backwards, as opposed to, well, we're going to roll out unconscious bias training for our top 5,000 leaders and assume this is going to somehow help, because guess what? That does not provide a how.
Yeah, no, I love that. I find that, Sally, I'm sure you find this as well. I find that with so many of my clients that they'll have the awareness. And then it's like, okay, I don't need any more awareness. I've got the awareness. I'm here. So what I need is, what do I do? What do I do? And that's a little bit harder, I think, because we think, oh, well, that's training. Oh, well, it takes time, but it's just these little simple things that you can do and change in your behavior when you're making a choice that really moves the needle. It makes it move.
Well, that's exactly right. And it is, I mean, any, 12-step program, for example, acts on the presumption that it is easier to act our way into a new way of thinking than to think our way into a new way of acting. People who have been addicted to a substance have given it plenty of thought, maybe for 20 or 30 years, but it's not helping. They need to act. They need to take new behaviors, practice them, and then that leads to a change in perspective and thinking. We have often been starting at the wrong end, and we've been starting at the wrong end because we don't know how to identify the habits and behaviors. So what I've tried to do is, first of all, look at the triggers that are most likely to undermine strong relationships across boundaries and specific ways to address those, and then look at some inclusive practices that can cover a broad spectrum, that can help create inclusive teams, inclusive cultures across the board.
I love that. I love that. And what's coming up for me as you talk is I'm just thinking of what someone else would say about this. I mean, because you bring so much wisdom there. So how do you get away with not faking it? Because people can tell when you're changing a behavior. Sometimes your intention is not what you just how you behave, right? So that I can see where that would be play in. But sometimes your intention is to be, as people hide behind, authentic, or be natural, or say whatever comes to my mind, and hey, you're being too politically correct here, telling me to change that behavior. What would you say, Sally, to those people who are interpreting it that way?
Well, it's interesting with this whole concept of political correctness and authenticity,
Right.
because often people will justify or rationalize saying very offensive things under, I call them like I see it, or
Exactly.
it's important to me to be authentic, or, I'm a truth teller. I tell the truth, let it land however it might. And so but guess what? That never worked in the workplace.
Right.
Absolutely ever. This is not new. You always
It
had
never
to
worked anywhere.
it never
Right, not
worked
just in the
anywhere.
workplace,
It
right?
never worked in the community
Like,
center. It never worked at a town meeting. It never worked if you were running for political office. Well, there's an argument about that, but that's a whole other topic.
right.
But it has never in the workplace been professional to privilege your own authenticity, what my colleague Marshall Goldsmith calls an excessive need to be me. Love
Yeah.
that phrase.
Yes.
Uh,
I'm seconding that, by the way. I always say that as well. Yes.
yeah,
Yep.
and I think we do a disservice. It's never worked to privilege that over professional behavior. And I think we do a disservice to people by telling them to always put authenticity first, or, bring your whole self to work at every opportunity. Because yes, sometimes that is very helpful, and sometimes it really doesn't work. And especially if you're someone who has limited exposure to people
Right.
who you perceive as different from you, your authentic responses are not helpful to
Well,
your
and
team.
and right, even there, I always say, Sally, and they're not really even authentic. They're cultural, right? So they're conditioned responses, potentially. They may not even be of original source, all right? So even that in itself is a very good point. Yeah. So you talk about these 8 triggers. What are these? Can you just share some of them with us? What you're talking about?
Yeah, a couple of them.
Yeah.
One trigger that's very common is visibility. So
Mhm.
we can be triggered by our own lack of visibility. People here just don't seem able to
Hmm.
appreciate my contributions. I guess in order to be successful, I probably have to behave like that showboat down the hall. Well, I don't want to be like that. Now, maybe here you come in and say, that's not authentic to me. Or maybe you're just totally turned off by that person. I don't want to be like that. So I guess, I'm a wonderful person, but I'll just have to suffer in silence. So we're triggered in that way. Now, triggers are environmental. We can't control them. They are emotional responses that come as a result of a situation we happen to find ourselves in. That's not the problem. The problem is the response that we have in terms of what we tell ourselves, the story we tell ourselves. So in this case, as so often, we tell ourselves, because we're triggered by our own lack of visibility, we tell ourselves a self-serving story that may or may not be true. Maybe that person isn't necessarily a showboat. Maybe we're just reacting. So what I would recommend in that kind of situation is sort of rewriting the script, or even saying something to yourself, okay, I feel very triggered by that guy down the hall who's always getting noticed, but he's really good at it. And it helps me understand that I'm uncomfortable with this whole subject of visibility. So I need to get better at it. Where could I start? Maybe it could be asking a colleague or friend who we trust. Do you have any suggestions that could, I need to address this. This isn't working for me. I'm feeling marginalized and undervalued. And that's not going to help me or anyone else. Maybe we can watch what the person who's very good at compelling notice, watch what they do and find our own way to reframe that. If they're saying, if a person that we're triggered by is saying, I had that client eating out of my hand, maybe we can put a different spin on it. That client and I really bonded well together. So in a way, you're asserting yourself that, you're claiming the visibility of this client relationship, but you're finding your own way of doing it rather than just dismissing, I don't want to be like
Right.
that person. So,
Right.
and it can work the other way. I've worked with successful executives who are triggered by a person's lack of visibility. Well, a person sits in the back all the time. He or she never speaks up. I don't know. Maybe it's the cultural background. Maybe it's just them, but they're
Right.
clearly not a player. So you're
It's a
dismissing
snap
that.
judgment immediately because of that trigger, which
Mhm.
who knows what the unconscious stuff that's going on in your head, but in the moment, it's really the behavior is what you're saying.
That's
It's like
exactly right.
trying to analyze all of that is not going to help the situation, right? At that moment.
Oh, correct. Yeah, that's really phrasing it. And I think that colleges and universities often do younger people coming into the workforce a great disservice because they give them the idea that what we need to do is banish triggers. We need to create trigger-free zones, et cetera, or create the opportunity for students to raise their hand if a professor mentions a book that they're not comfortable with and saying, we can't talk about this, I'm being triggered.
Right.
Okay, that's fine. But guess what? That's not going to work in the workplace,
Right.
and it's not going to work in the world. And by trying to avoid triggers, what we do is we make it very difficult to learn how to effectively respond and to practice
Oh.
those effective responses.
And we become more polarized because if
Mhm.
you're constantly avoiding your triggers and not
Yes,
working
exactly.
through them,
Right.
then there is the polarization, right? Which is what we see happening today. So yeah, that's all the really important points there. Yeah.
Thank you.
So what other words of wisdom would you offer to them as we depart today?
Well, I think that for leaders, it's really, really helpful to share this kind of point of view with younger people coming up, saying, we understand that you may have situations here that make you uncomfortable. Not saying something like, so deal with it. No,
Right.
we understand that you'll have situations like that. What I want to urge you to do is to think about how you can respond effectively with two things in mind. Number one, how could you maybe diffuse the situation so it doesn't become uncomfortable for the people you work with together? How could you do that? And number two, how can you make sure that your response serves your long-term interests? Because that's what really matters here. You want to be able to create a sustainable, energizing, and rewarding career path for yourself. We believe you're in a place where you can do that. So part of what I'm asking is that you think about how you can use these opportunities when you do feel triggered or uncomfortable with something, to practice maybe a way to respond that will serve you. I think that's a very, very good thing. The other thing that I think is really helpful for leaders is to think about, diversity and inclusion in, which is really what I'm addressing here. I'm addressing diversity and inclusion, diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm now
Right.
seeing a fourth letter, I don't know, whatever. But that whole issue, really recognize that diversity is a word we use to describe the reality of the talent pool. Inclusion are inclusive practices are those required to lead and manage effectively a diverse talent pool. And the more we can convey that to the people broadly in our organizations, the bigger sign on we'll have for these initiatives, which in some cases have become unpopular. What we're doing here has to do with being able to, as that guy at the construction super conference said to me, being able to attract and retain the workforce we have now, or if we don't, we're not going to be competitive. So how do we do that? So I think that's a really helpful way for organizations to frame this initiative. And when I hear leaders say diversity is our goal, I think, nope, you're missing it. You're missing it. Diversity is the reality. And finding a way to lead the diverse workforce inclusively is your task.
Yeah. So come full circle with that, Sally, because there's so much there. Full circle to your event with the construction group, right? And so if you come full circle and you say, well, Sally, don't tell us about women in leadership and why, we know that. How do you think these practices will help that group, for example, and of course any other company? But if they started to practice it, how would that help them with this whole notion of women in leadership and promoting women and all of that?
I think it would help them tremendously because they would be practicing behaviors that would send a message to women. This is a good place for you to work. This is a safe place for you to work. We will hold to account anybody who tries to undermine what we're doing in creating a culture in which you feel safe. And here are the practices and the behaviors that we expect of our employees and that we really require of our employees so that we can create an environment in which people everywhere can flourish. We're not the thought police. We're not trying to police what people think. People can think whatever they want to think, but they have certain ways that they need to act, or we are not going to be effective at managing and leading the workforce as it exists now and will exist even more in the years ahead.
Yeah. Wow. And so there's so much there. I mean, I could talk to you for the whole day, because we can unpeel that one and go to mindset and so many different facets. But I like the way we broke this up into behavior for today. Because I think mindset is a whole other piece, and it does matter. I mean, we can't ignore that mindset matters, but I think what you're offering us today is a practical way to look at your own behavior and change your own behavior. And that's really the choice, right? Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Just one thing about the mindset thing. Yes, of course, what you're thinking matters. But a really helpful thing is to think, I'm kind of skeptical of this, but I'm going to give it a shot. I'm going to see how this lands. I'm going to see how this resonates. I'm going to see if I get different results with this kind of habit, this kind of approach. Because that's how we begin to shift our mindsets. Our mindsets are not set in stone.
No.
I'm sure that you, like me, I can look back to things I thought 30 or 40 years ago and think, oh my Lord, was that me? But, yeah, it was me. It was the me of then. I had a certain mindset. It evolved. And often it evolves in response to our experiences. So when we practice different behaviors, we can create different experiences, and that will modulate our thinking.
Perfect words to end on today, Sally. Thank you so much for sharing your words of wisdom with me. I'm delighted to have had you on the podcast, and I'm sure the listeners will benefit. And we'll have the link and all the information about how they can get your book. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janet. Thank you. I really enjoyed this.